Hello, fiendlings, how the hell are ya? Today is the first episode of the Medusa Zone, a short novel I wrote for Raventail Publishing. It's the first book I've written that takes place in the deep ocean since I finished The Black. Returning to the deeps was a blast, and I hope it shows. But rather than spending time on more introductory notes, how about we jump in? Be safe, have a great rest of the week, and we'll talk again real soon. Here's episode 1 of the Medusa Zone. 1. Stu stared out over the ocean, eyes scanning for anything that might suggest a ship was heading their way. While they weren't exactly in the middle of the shipping lanes, you never knew when one of the massive monsters would appear on the horizon, or when a commercial fishing vessel might invade your space. Spotting obstacles and ships on the ocean was a little game his father had played with them when they first sailed to the Virgin Islands. Every ship Stu sighted before his father earned him a quarter. When he spotted a whale in the distance, his father had paid him $1. Stu grew to like whales more than other ships. Wilma walked through the cockpit hatch and onto the deck, a squat silver thermal mug in her hands. She placed it on the console and stepped back. "The captain's coffee," she said. "Thanks," Stu said. He lifted his mug, took a sip, and cringed at the taste. "Something wrong with my coffee?" Wilma asked suspiciously. He grinned at her as he pulled off the lid. "It's 11 a.m. Needs a little kick." He pulled the flask of Irish whiskey from the console shelf and added a generous helping to the mug. After replacing the lid and swirling it around, he took another taste. Better. Wilma rolled her eyes. "Aren't you supposed to be the sober one? The one on watch for idiocy and silliness?" "Yep," he said. "So I expect you all to behave yourselves." Wilma pointed to the cockpit. "My boyfriend hardly ever behaves. Does Jenna?" "No," he wanted to say, but it wasn't really true. Jenna would take care of Martin, and neither had been drinking. Yet, that was. Stu took another sip, marveling at how good the whiskey felt as it hit his belly. He didn't care that it was hot, or that he'd sweat. If he got too hot, he could always take a quick dip. Jenna walked through the cockpit hatch, her modest blue one-piece swimsuit complementing her deep tan. He was pleased to see she still wore her deck shoes. They'd had that conversation more than once. Stu still didn't understand how a person who grew up around boats didn't know the basic rules. Oh, she knows. She just doesn't care. That was probably more true than even she wanted to admit. Still, he loved her all the more for it. Jenna blinked at Wilma. "You're not going swimming?" Wilma turned to Stu. "How many feet of water are we in?" Stu grinned. "About 800 feet." 800 feet, Wilma repeated, trading a serious stare with Jenna. "No fucking way." Jenna chuckled. "Look, the chances of you encountering a shark out here or a whale or something large enough to eat you are pretty slim. So long as you're not splashing around, that is." "Nope, doesn't sound like good odds to me," Wilma said, holding her hands across her chest as though experiencing a chill. "I'll stay on the boat with Stu." She eyed his flask of whiskey. "Maybe have a coffee." Jenna glared at Stu. "Already?" "Hey, you were the one that put it in my coffee this morning," he said, his hands held up in defense. She stuck her tongue out at him. "Martin," she called over her shoulder. "You coming or what?" Yeah, a deep voice said from inside the cockpit. "Getting my deck shoes." Jenna turned to Stu. "See, I'm not the only one who thinks it's stupid." "It's not stupid," he said patiently, "especially not if we're moving." "But we're not," she said, gesturing to the ocean. "Not much, anyway." "Too easy to slip off and go in the drink when you don't mean to," he said, shaking his head. He'd seen it happen more than once. Yeah, Jenna said. Martin stepped out of the cockpit in a red swimsuit without a shirt. Stu nearly smirked. They'd been at sea for 4 days now, and Martin still hadn't seemed to have broken in his deck shoes. What did he expect buying cheap shit? "Can we go in the water now?" Jenna asked. "You're like a little kid," Stu said, laughing. "Yes, my darling wife, you may go in the water, with a life jacket." "Duh, on the life jacket," she said. "I'm crazy, not stupid." She kissed him on the mouth and their tongues briefly touched. When she pulled back, he saw the sparkle of mischief in her green eyes. "You're okay with this?" He took another sip of coffee. "I'm fine with it. Just make sure one of you has the line at all times." "Get the masks, Martin," Jenna said without turning around. "I'll get the jackets." She brushed her hand lightly against Stu's crotch. "I'm thinking early afternoon nap, Tiger." he said, trying not to dump over the mug in surprise. That sounds nice. She kissed him again on the cheek, turned, and walked to the second of the 2 diving compartments. How likely are they to see a shark? Wilma asked quietly. Not likely, Stu said. Jenna's right. You have to have noise or blood in the water to attract a shark. Neither of them have open cuts, and so long as they just float out there, they shouldn't have any problems at all. Famous last words, Wilma breathed and reached for the flask. Hey, he said, that's mine. Sharing is caring, she said, walking inside the cockpit. Ready? Jenna called to Martin. They each wore a life jacket and carried a mask and snorkel. Stu thought it unlikely they'd see much below the surface, but he knew from experience what it was like to look down, and realized that the water was so deep it was impossible to see the bottom, and that you'd never survive attempting to go there. Worst of all, it reminded you that you were swimming in a deadly, inhospitable biome that only saw you as food. As far as he was concerned, it was a good perspective to have. Growing up in the boat business, he'd always heard tell of complacency leading to disasters. He'd made his mind up a long time ago not to end up as a cautionary tale told at the harbor bars. A little alcohol during sailing time? Not a big deal. Stu knew how to regulate, and he only let loose when they were anchored. Considering the water depth, he wouldn't be able to get stinking drunk until a day or 2 from now when they were much closer to shore. And then Jenna would have to be dead sober. She knew how to pilot Jenna's dream nearly as well as he did. He'd forced her to sail a 4-day trip both ways without helping her make any adjustments. He wouldn't even answer questions. She'd been pissed at him for the first 2 days but hadn't complained or grumbled on the way home. By then, she'd figured it all out. That's why he was confident enough to have a little whiskey now and then. Right now, with his wife and Martin in the water, he had to be extra watchful. Need another belt? Wilma asked as she returned with the coffee and the flask. Stu took the flask from her and placed it in its holster. I'm good. Okay, Stu, we're ready, Jenna said. She and Martin stood at the edge of the dive stairs. Sighing, Stu turned and walked to join them. Watch your step, Martin. It can be slick, he said. Gotcha, Martin said. Jenna quickly took the 2 steps down and began taking off her shoes. That looked easy. It is, Stu agreed. I'm just careful. Martin grinned. I'm glad for it. Otherwise I wouldn't be dumb enough to do this. It's not dumb, Jenna said, raising her hands in frustration. It's just water. Uh-huh, Martin said. Really, it's not that bad, Stu said, clapping him on the back. Just remember what Nietzsche said. Martin merely blinked at him. Huh? When you stare into the abyss, he said, grinning. Martin waited for him to finish, but Stu just held his stare. And? He finally said. Stu's grin faded into a grim line. The abyss also looks into you. Okay, Martin said nervously and stepped onto the dive deck. If he knew Martin better and this wasn't only their second time being around one another for a long stretch, he'd consider pushing the man into the ocean. Alas, this wasn't Mikey, Stu's best friend and erstwhile dive partner, who would have found it funny. Jenna had stowed her deck shoes and fitted her mask and snorkel. She was about as ready as she could get. Without waiting for Martin, she lowered herself into the water and slipped beneath the surface with hardly a sound. All right, Martin, Stu said. Take off your shoes, sit on the edge of the dive deck like she did, and just lower yourself into the water. And don't splash, Martin said to himself. Right. Seriously, dude, it'll be fine. Otherwise, I wouldn't let my crazy wife out there. Good to know, he said, sounding less and less like he wanted to do this. Now Stu really wanted to push him. Martin walked to the edge, nearly lost his balance, dropped to his knees, and slowly rotated until his feet were in the water. Stu stifled a laugh at the clumsy ballet Martin had just performed. He figured laughter wouldn't help set the man at ease. Martin donned his mask and snorkel and slowly lowered himself into the water with the tiniest of splashes. When he bobbed to the surface, he was treading water, his head swiveling to look across the ocean. Stu watched them for a moment before returning to the console. That's it? Wilma asked. What do you mean? You're not going to watch? She asked. He sipped his coffee and gestured to the ocean. Have to watch out there, too. You can babysit the kids, Mom. She punched him lightly in the arm. I will, but only because I can drink. He raised his mug. I'll toast to that. Jenna lay on her back in the ocean and let the sun wash over her. The day had clouds, but they were mostly off to the west. Some weather might move in later, but at that moment, it was a bright day with a beautiful ocean. So what do we do? Martin asked. She noticed he was moving his hands more than he needed to, and was probably doing the same with his legs. First off, she said, lowering her legs until she bobbed on the water beside him, the life jacket will keep you afloat, so don't worry about that. You don't have to exert much effort to move either. We're just following the boat in the current. And you have the line? She held up her left fist, a heavy red nylon rope dangling out of it. I've got us, she promised. Just stay near me, okay? Don't have to worry about that, he said. Okay, Martin, I want you to place your face in the water and breathe through the snorkel. Just let your eyes soak in what you see. Soak? He asked with a furrowed eyebrow. Jenna blushed slightly. Bad pun. Okay, let your eyes wander. Better? Better, he said with a grin. After clamping the snorkel mouthpiece between his teeth, he lowered his head into the water. Without her having to tell him, he raised his legs and ended up floating on his belly. Jenna put her face in the water and immediately saw what she'd expected to. A vast blue stretching into infinity, its shade growing darker the lower she looked. Gooseflesh rose on her arms despite the relatively warm water. She was floating in the middle of an ocean, over 100 miles from shore, with the bottom far out of reach. Out here, there was no lifeguard to save you from drowning, and no immediate help if something happened. There were no hospitals floating nearby or helpful emergency clinics. They had to rely on themselves or wait up to an hour for a U.S. Coast Guard, USCG, helicopter to reach them. The emptiness of the ocean itself also fueled a momentary fear. It was as if everything had died, and they were the last beings alive on the planet, floating above a graveyard. Where are they? She heard Martin ask in a nasal baritone. She lifted her head and looked at him through the mask. The fish? He nodded. Deep, really deep. Martin dropped his face again to the water. A moment later, he cleared the snorkel and looked disappointed. Wow, so not much going on up here. Nope. You ever been diving? He shook his head and looked a little embarrassed. Nothing more serious than the snorkel experience at Eshkare. That's not out in the ocean. Imagine not, she said. We should take you and Wilma out for a snorkeling trip at some point. You mean I haven't worn out my welcome? Not yet. Be on the best of your worst behavior and you'll be fine. She nodded to the water. What do you think? He shook his head, looking a little wonderstruck. Stu said it was like staring into an abyss. Not sure he's right about that, but it does feel like you're looking into eternity. There's very little light down there, she said, peering into the endless depths. I've done 100 feet before, and it gets dark in a hurry. Can't imagine being in the dark and swimming in this. That just sounds terrifying. Jenna grinned. Well, snorkeling the shallows in the dark is fun, but you don't want to be out here at night, I can guarantee you that. Oh, hell no. I won't even take you up on snorkeling in the dark. Bad enough being surrounded by shit that can eat you, but not being able to see them? Fuck that. Jenna laughed and put her face back into the water. She'd hoped that a fish might come up to the surface or a school of something would pass them by. No such luck. The water was completely devoid of life. Not even patches of drifting seaweed. If there was one thing she disliked about the deep ocean, it was the lack of marine fauna close to the surface. When you snorkeled in the shallows or went scuba diving down to a reef or a wreck, the ocean teemed with life. Small fish of all species and colors raced through a reef's cracks and crevices, schools of curious barracuda floating nearby. Sea anemones waved in the current, and crabs sidled across the sand. The occasional moray eel or shark might make an appearance to give you the chills, but they usually left you alone. Out here, the predators were deadly. They could either drown you or just plain eat you. Encountering the monsters of the deep ocean was quite a different experience than swimming with schools of clownfish. The first time she'd seen a large shark fin piercing the ocean surface, she'd instantly realized just how vulnerable she'd have been had she been in the water. Swimming the shallows was how she fell in love with the ocean, but the deep ocean is what made her respect it. She blew water out of the snorkel and brought her face back up. Martin was staring into the abyss again. She grinned. Stu had been an asshole to say that to him. Then again, Stu could have told him there were great whites out here that would eat his face, or maybe the killer orcas were on their way. Hey, Jenna? Wilma called down from the starboard deck. Jenna turned and looked upward. What's up? Stu says there's something at 3 o'clock. Jenna found the sun, imagined it was the 12 on a clock, swiveled her head toward the imaginary 3, and shielded her eyes. It took her a minute to find it, but once she did, it was difficult to lose sight of it. It looked like several dark dots floating on the ocean surface. They had to be at least a quarter-mile away, although it was difficult to tell. Martin raised his head and followed her gaze. "What is that?" Jenna shook her head. "I don't know. I'm guessing Stu is getting the binoculars out to check." "Not sharks?" he said anxiously. "No," she said. "We wouldn't see them until they were much, much closer." She didn't want to tell him that they probably wouldn't know about a shark until it was right on top of them. Making him more paranoid wasn't going to help anybody. "I think we should get back to the boat. When there's strange shit on its way, I'd rather be safe than sorry." "Besides," Martin nodded, "there's a Modelo with my name on it." Jenna lifted the line so he could see it. "Just grab and drag yourself to the boat. Oh, and mind the dinghy." "I will," Martin said. It didn't take him long to get to the boat. They'd only drifted about 10 feet in all their time swimming. The current was lazy today. Couple that with a nearly absent breeze, and the ocean was the calmest she'd ever seen it. She sighed and began crawling the line hand over hand to reach the dive deck. By the time she arrived, Martin had already put on his deck shoes and was toweling off. Jenna finally pulled herself into the boat, grabbed her deck shoes, and quickly slid them on. When she turned to climb the steps onto the deck, she found Stu standing there with a pair of binoculars. "You're not going to believe this," he said and held them out to her. She took the binoculars, located the dots on the horizon, and looked through the lenses. Instead of a few dots, she realized there were at least 24 shapes floating on the ocean surface. They weren't in any kind of organized formation, which didn't much surprise her, but the similarity of the shapes was quite eerie. Each looked like a crystal blue bob riding the waves. "What the hell are they?" "Don't know. Whatever they are, they're as big as inflated trash bags," he said. Jenna handed back the binoculars and wrung out her shoulder-length hair. "Enjoy your swim?" he asked. Jenna grinned. "I did. Would have been better naked, but I didn't want to embarrass Martin." "What?" Martin called from the benches beneath the tonneau. "Nothing," Stu said before smirking at Jenna. "Go dry off. Maybe remind Martin where the beer is." She rolled her eyes. "He doesn't need reminding. We're down to a 12-pack. After that, it's 6 bottles of wine, a bottle of whiskey, and half a bottle of tequila." Stu took another sip from his mug. "That gets us to Galveston. Unless," he said, gesturing to Martin, who had just appeared with a beer can in his hands, "he decides to go on a bender." "Doubt that. Pretty sure he'd like to get laid this trip." "Wouldn't we all?" Stu muttered. She punched him lightly in the stomach. "Be patient, Mr. Diggler." Stu blushed. "Right." "Hey, Stu," Martin called. "Yeah?" Something was buzzing in the cockpit. She exchanged a glance with Stu. "Weather?" "Maybe." "I'll go check," she said over her shoulder as she walked into the cockpit. The weather fax was indeed blinking and buzzing. Frowning, she pulled the sheet of paper and quickly scanned it. Wilma, sitting at the table with a book, raised her eyebrows. Jenna forced a smile and folded the piece of paper. "Something important?" Wilma asked. "Maybe," she said, and walked from the cockpit. She hadn't wanted to scare Wilma, but what she saw on the piece of paper was a report of high winds and a hell of a storm. They were right in its path. Stu looked off to the southwest and saw more and more clouds gathering. A large anvil of puffy, gray-stained cotton rose in the sky like a portent of doom. The gestating storm was still quite a ways off, but it was heading in their direction. Fortunately, the wind was kicking up and they could get moving. All he had to do was try and move northwest to skirt the storm. He hoped. The problem? Either the forecasters hadn't been paying attention or he and Jenna had fallen down on the job. The storm was huge and quickly building. So far, the meteorologists were calling it a tropical wave, but with sustained winds of 25 miles an hour and gusts of 50, it would be a bit more than a little thunderstorm. It'd be like a mini tropical storm. No way could he evade it with just the engines. They simply weren't powerful enough. Instead, he'd have to rig the sails if he wanted to get out of it. Or he could heave to, angle the sails, and ride out the storm. But he didn't like that idea. For one, he had a chance to escape. The storm was moving at 7 knots, and now that the breeze had stiffened into a wind, he could outrun it or at least flank it. The second reason? Riding out a storm this large would be harrowing for Martin and Wilma. Jenna would have no problem. She and Stu had been in worse together. "Batten down the hatches," he thought, pressing the button for the windlass. The anchor rattled its way up with a hum of electric motors. Jenna immediately appeared in the cockpit doorway. "We running?" He grinned at her. "We're running. I think we can miss the worst of it." "You think? How solid is that?" He shrugged. "Not solid enough for my liking." "Well, it won't be that bad. For us, anyway." He smiled at that. She was right, of course. He'd been seasick a fefew times, but not since his teens, and that had been during a Category 1 hurricane. How hospitable. You going to dangle the food in front of them, too? She snickered and looked off to starboard, her fingers slowly rising. Look at those, she said in wonder. Stu turned and immediately saw what she was looking at. The objects that had once been so distant were practically on top of them. He now understood what they were, and his mouth practically dropped open. The 24 shapes were a flotilla that included 24 more. Each looked like a giant blue and purple glass bottle whose upper portion had been flattened into a sail. Tendrils and tentacles flowed beneath the creatures into the depths. Jesus, Stu said. I've never seen Portuguese man-o-war that big. The tops of the sails had to be at least 2 feet from the creature's base, and their 4-foot-long bodies glistened in the dimming sunlight. The massive group of creatures drifted off to starboard aft, their sails catching the wind. The occasional jag of lightning flashed across the backdrop of swollen and bruised anvil-shaped clouds, making the creatures seem even more surreal. How long do you think their tentacles are? Jenna asked, joining him at the gunwale. Stu looked down at one of the passing monstrosities. The finger-thick, unfurled tentacles seemed to stretch into oblivion. I bet they go 400 feet down, he said. Maybe more. Wonder how big a fish they could catch, Jenna said softly. Shark, maybe? Maybe, Stu said, thinking more about what they might do to a human. The creature's blue crystalline sails were hardly uniform, each having more blue or purple than the next, and their sizes ranged from 3 feet long to a monstrous 5. The tentacles glowed a neon green he'd never seen in nature. They're horrific. After a beat, Jenna snickered and glanced at him with a mischievous look. Hey, she called into the cockpit. Look out the starboard side. Okay, she heard Wilma say. What's the... Holy shit, what are those? Jenna grinned at Stu. Should we tell her they fly? He laughed and ended with a snort. That would be funny, but one that big would kill you in minutes. He shook his head. Correction, seconds. You'd either stop breathing or drown. She put her arm around his waist. You say such romantic things. He leaned down and kissed her while they watched the floating creatures move off to the northeast, their sails tacking to the wind. I don't even know what eats those things, but I'm guessing it'd have to be big to choke down one of those. He chuckled. Ever pop one? Excuse me? Jenna asked. Pop what? A man-o-war? Yeah, ever pop one? She blinked at him. You can't be serious. I am, he said with a smile. We were on the beach with some kids we'd met, and there had been a storm the night before. He pointed at the retreating horde. A whole bunch of those things littered the shallow surf. One of the kids grabbed a stick, did a little dance, and then threw the stick at the blue bottle. And? His grin widened. It popped. It did not. Swear to God it did. It sounded like an overfilled balloon hit with a knitting needle. Boom. You telling me you followed suit? He shook his head, laughing. No. You know why? She shook her head. Because some of the stingers went airborne. Kid got some on his legs and was howling. Figured I didn't want to end up like him. How old were you? I don't know. 10 maybe? Probably old enough to know better, but young enough to do it anyway. But you didn't. Nope. Young, not dumb. She giggled and kissed him as Martin and Wilma left the cockpit. Want to tell me what the fuck those were? Martin asked after letting loose a mighty belch. Well, Jenna said, first off, they fly.